Mencken hated Bryan, I think, for a lot of reasons. Bryan was an advocate of prohibition. Mencken loved his beer. He held Bryan's religious views in contempt. But beyond that, Bryan represented a kind of reform tradition, a kind of voice of ordinary people, a voice of grassroots America that Mencken really held in contempt. Beneath Mencken's ridicule of the ignorant hayseeds of America was a very profound suspicion of democracy itself. Mencken really believed that there was a small elite of educated and cultivated and intelligent human beings, and then there were the masses who were really ignorant and capable of nothing but being led and bamboozled.
On the afternoon of the fourth day, the prosecution called its first witnesses. When the time came for cross-examination, Darrow went on the offensive. Under his interrogation, the students of John Scopes admitted that learning Darwin's theory of evolution from their football coach had in no way damaged their faith or their character. School Superintendent Walter White conceded that the textbook Scopes was accused of using, Hunter's Civic Biology, was the official biology textbook of the state of Tennessee. F.E. Robinson testified that he himself sold copies of the offending textbook in his drugstore, where John Scopes had been arrested. Scopes himself never took the stand, but to many of the reporters, he was the hero of the story.
They saw Scopes as a guy who volunteered for this case, who wasn't a bad guy, who may not have even done what he was on trial for, and so they were all pulling for him.
Frankly, Scopes was being used. Essentially, the case had been taken over by the big names.
If his client was convicted, Darrow would appeal the case to the Tennessee Supreme Court. Until then, he wanted to use the monkey trial to enlighten America. To that end, the defense team brought prominent scientists to Dayton to testify for evolution. The scientists had been carefully selected to prove that devout Christians also believed in evolution. Their star witness, Professor Maynard Metcalf, was a staunch evolutionist from Johns Hopkins University, who taught Sunday school at his congregational church.
I think that the only thing they were down here for was to propound the theory of evolution, and this was a great place to do it. It was right in the middle of the Bible Belt. So here they have a golden opportunity to come down here and put on the theory of evolution in a courtroom with the greatest fundamentalist of all, being William Jennings Bryan, on the other side.
Was the scientific testimony relevant to the case? Judge Ralston hadn't made up his mind. So when the defense called Professor Metcalf to explain evolution, he banished the jury from the courtroom.
Even though they had clamored to be on the jury so that they could have front row seats, they only were in the courtroom for a few hours during the 8-day trial. As it turned out, they heard very little of the trial of the century.
So far, William Jennings Bryan had said little. He was on a strict diet to control diabetes. He had lost weight and he suffered from the heat.
Bryan knew from the start that he was on trial as much as anybody else at Dayton, that his idea of anti-evolution laws had been widely criticized and he needed to defend them.
Bryan felt confident that the jury would convict John Scopes. He focused his energy on writing his closing argument, a speech he knew would be carried live on radio and quoted all over America. It would bring to light all the fears about Darwinism that had haunted him for years. As a young man, Bryan had been open-minded about evolution. To him, all that mattered was that God had infused man with a soul. But by the turn of the century, certain rich and powerful men were using evolution to justify social inequality. If life on Earth had evolved through survival of the fittest, they argued, why should the strong help the weak to survive? The theory came to be known as social Darwinism.
If you see a drunk in the gutter, the best thing you can do is to leave him in the gutter. Because if you pull him out of the gutter and you clean him up and you let him marry another drunk, they're going to have drunk children. And now we're going to have 5 or 6 drunks where here we only had 1 or 2. Let them perish. That's what their fate should be. That was social Darwinism at its worst.
Then came the First World War, and Bryan saw evidence that social Darwinism was being carried to a chilling extreme. In a book called Headquarters Nights, he read a first-hand account of the German philosophy of war, a philosophy inspired by the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche. The German military believed it was engaged in a global battle for the salvation of the human species. Many German officers became convinced that Germany was the super race, destined to win the so-called evolutionary struggle for existence.
Bryan began, even on his own, to see a straight line between Darwin to Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who talked about the Superman, Nietzsche, who laughed at Christianity as an ideology of slaves. Of course, slaves are going to say that the weak inherit, the meek inherit the earth. Why shouldn't they? They're slaves. But the strong shouldn't believe in that kind of religion.
The Germans during World War I and the Nazis during World War II leaned upon a scientific idea, natural selection, to support their particular agendas. But that's nothing new. You find people using scientific ideas, warping the scientific ideas for their particular ends from the time that science was invented, I suspect.
Bryan believed that social Darwinism was being promoted in the very textbook John Scopes was accused of using.
He felt that because not only did it present a Darwinian view of evolution in general, but it also contained many of the theories that most Americans found objectionable.
Hunter's civic biology used evolution to justify the selective breeding of human beings. If the poor, the insane, and the handicapped were lower animals, it said, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race.
The textbook that Scopes used would by today's standards be considered erroneous, not good science. That's because we've learned a lot more about nature, a lot more about evolution, a lot more about human variation than was known back in 1925. Now, we would not have made those discoveries if we had decided, oh, those ideas are untouchable, we can't explore them. We just have to sweep them under the rug because we don't like their social implications.
Bryan had compiled a long list of the dangers he saw in Darwin's theory. His closing argument at the Scopes trial would embrace them all. It was the hottest week of the summer in East Tennessee. In the courtroom, everyone noticed that only the judge had a fan. As the temperature crept towards 100 degrees, they all looked for a way to keep cool.
Monkey business down in Tennessee. My Lulu made me fall. I'm monkey after all. Monkey business now.
Prosecuting attorney Ben McKenzie had a taxi cab deliver whiskey from Chattanooga to his office in Dayton, where Clarence Darrow would join him for a drink.
It was more of a good time that everybody got together because they were the old school that attorneys, regardless of what side you were on, you were still friends and you could get along. And so there wasn't any animosity between Darrow and my grandfather. In fact, they became big buddies as a result of this trial.